Hello, welcome to Nailing It Down, a production of Barnblog. And today we are talking about Vilfredo Federico Damaso Pareto, or as he was known when he was born, Wilfred Fritz Pareto. Roughly a contemporary of Max Weber, and important in many different fields. Vilfredo Pareto was an Italian polymath. He was a civil engineer, a sociologist, an economist, a political scientist, and a philosopher. He made many important contributions to economics, founded the Italian elite school, and was crucial to the second wave of the transition to neoclassical economics from classical political economy, and was very interested in understanding income distribution and analysis of individuals' choices. Unlike Marx and Weber, Pareto was a methodological individualist. And disentangling his economics from his sociology takes a little bit of work. Now, we've already become familiar with one of Vilfredo Pareto's allies in the elite school. We have talked about the iron law of oligarchy as thought of by Robert Michel. Pareto has a much more subtle understanding of the situation and is somewhat more akin to Max Weber in that it tries to deal with multi-causal analysis. And indeed, Vilfredo Pareto actually thought classes or social categories could be infinite, that it really did depend on how you were dividing them up, but it was useful for understanding society to pick elements that were easily monitored and could be reduced down for explanatory reasons. He also weirdly reads a lot more like a modern sociologist or economist. Now, I think it's interesting when we talk about sociology and economics now, because generally sociologists and economists in the modern sense tend to be somewhat opposed to each other, with people in the academy who often favor social psychology or behavioral economics kind of borderlining in between them. But Pareto comes up with a few key rules that we need to understand. But let's deal with his biography before we go into it. Pareto was born of an exiled noble household of Genovese origin in 1848 in Paris. And in fact, his original birth name was a celebration of his mother, Marie Metternich's, enthusiasm for the revolution of 1848 in the German states. But they italicized his name when they returned to Italy in 1858. Despite his noble upbringing, Pareto actually mostly lived in a middle-class environment. Middle class here meaning professional or bourgeois. Though he had a very high standard of education, and he attended the Istituto Tecnico Lerdi, studying mathematics, and he got his doctorate in engineering from the Polytechnic University of Turin in 1869. And one of his early dissertations was the fundamental principles of equilibrium in solid bodies. His interest in equilibrium is actually probably one of the origins of equilibrium theory in both economics and sociology. Equilibrium theory is that you are moving towards a state of balanced trade and stable society. Now, a lot of people trace his interest in equilibrium and social and economic transactions all the way back to his initial physics research. He worked as a civil engineer for a while. First for the state-owned Italian railway company, and later in private industry. He was a manager of the ironworks of San Giovanni Valdarno, and later was a general manager for the Italian ironworks. He did not really look in economics and do serious economic study until his mid-40s. He was a fiery advocate of what is generally considered classical liberalism. Now, classical liberalism as an idea is often misunderstood. Now, I might go off on this later, but it's a political tradition in the branch of liberalism that tends to advocate free market economics, civil liberties with rule of law, limited government, economic freedom, political freedom, and freedom of speech. But in general can also be seen as birthing other movements such as social liberalism, etc. Classical liberalism is generally seen now, and even by the time of Pareto's life, as being skeptical of regulation, social policies, or taxations beyond tariffs. Social liberalism, while is often seen as growing in the Anglo-American tradition with the Great Depression, actually also has roots in classical liberalism's more radical bent. We could go into that one day, but safely to say that it's complicated here. So, Pareto noticed in 1843 that the political division of wealth, he became very interested in why there might be stratums of wealth. So if this feels like it corresponds with social class, it's because it does. He was fueled by frustrations with government regulators and also with monopoly capital practices. And we have to remember that he was dealing with this in the 1880s. The Italian state had really just solidified. In 1893, he managed to succeed Leon Walras as the political economic chair of the University of Lausanne in Sweden, where he remained in the rest of his life. He published a textbook containing the Pareto distribution of how wealth is distributed, which he believed was constant through any human society in any age or country in all times. He called it the 80-20 rule. His famous observation was that 20% of the population generally owned 80% of the property in Italy, and it was later generalized into larger social principles by the thinker Joseph Joron, who actually coined the phrase Pareto principle. Although Pareto, interestingly, was friends with many socialists, but he argued against them. He became suspicious of their motives and denounced socialist leaders as an aristocracy of brigands late in his life, and criticized the government of Giovanni Gelati for not taking a tougher stance against worker strikes. We can already see the beginning of his conservative liberalism here. He increasingly became upset with labor unrest and put himself increasingly in the anti-socialist and anti-democratic camp of Italian politics. And his attitudes towards fascism are unclear, although he was clearly an inspiration to Mosca and Robert Michel's, whose attitudes towards fascism are more readily established. Pareto's later years actually are when he becomes interested in sociology. And his best-known sociological work was published in 1916, The Mind and Society. And then his final work was the Compendium of General Sociology, which he published in 1920. Pareto generally believed that while there were many, many social classes, the only ones you really needed to be concerned with were elites. Now, he talks about several kinds of elites, and he talks about their circulation. He's famous for actually believing in a social cycle theory, and that history is a graveyard of aristocracies, with the cycle of what kind of aristocracies emerge turning around. Now, he's not often considered the first modern social cycle theorist. He's not the first social cycle theorist. It was common. Ancient Greeks believed it. Ibn Khaldun, the Muslim historian and philosopher, also believed in social cycle theory. But social cycle for him is actually kind of interesting, and he tried to mathematically draw it out based off his prior observations in economics. And for example, he believed that most people acted roughly rationally in regards to their way of life, which he considered like the Darwinian principle, that most people kind of functioned optimally in aggregate for what they needed to survive in a general situation. It's actually something I also believe. Pareto picked a lot up from Machiavelli, and he thought of there being two kinds of elites, governing and non-governing elites. Non-governing elites having all kinds of various positions. Non-governing elites were mostly economic elites, but they could also be cultural elites, aristocrats outside of the government, that sort of thing. He classifies them in categories 1 through 6, and then he breaks down governing elites into 2 categories as well. There is class 1 are the foxes, which he gets from Machiavelli, and class 2, the lions. And roughly, foxes are more mercantile, more given towards intelligence, less likely to use violence, can generally be spoken of as manipulative. They roughly correspond to some of the traits of liberalism, but that's actually a dangerous assumption because that's not really what he's saying. And then there's a more conservative lions, which is class 2 in the government elites. Now, he looks at this as a general temperament and intelligence issue. Lions are given towards hierarchy, want a stable bureaucracy, and are okay with using violence. Foxes are more egalitarian, roughly, but also more socially manipulative and tend to rule towards rules and commerce. They also tend to be more adventurous and less socially conservative than lions. And he sees this as these two types of leaders as going back and forth in elite categories and who can govern. Although he says that a governing elite that was the most effective would have both class 1 and class 2, both foxes and lions, throughout the government. Because you need both, quote, men capable of decisive force and men who are imaginative, innovative, and completely unscrupulous. When imperfections in the circulation of government elites prevent the attainment of judicious messengers, government breaks down and generates into hidebound and ossified bureaucracies or weak regimes of lawyers and rhetoricians incapable of decisive and forceful action. And when this happens, another elite group from outside the government elites will often intervene and overthrow it, or in extreme situations, another group from the non-elite may even become an elite factor. Now, we'll notice here that this is multi-causal, but way more given to analogy than what we see in Marx or even Weber. This foxes and lions metaphor also runs through his ideas around speculation and rentier relations and elite economics. He saw foxes as speculators, kind of like venture capitalists, and lions as rentiers who are trying to stabilize their income and govern effectively at the cost of large surpluses of income or large profits. And he also sees these as operating in cycles, and that a strong economy will have both in a roughly balanced measure. Now, Pareto has a lot of influence on Garatena Mosca and Robert Michel. So if you want to learn about Robert Michel, check out my video on the iron law of oligarchy and its limits. He also has influence on C. Wright Mills, who, while more influenced by Marx, was very influenced by Pareto. Floyd Hunter, James Burnham, who's going to come up very soon, the American ex-Trotskyist who founded the idea of the Managerial Revolution, which he ran through 2 books, The Managerial Revolution and the second book, The Machiavellians. The sociologist Robert Putnam, who is more dominant now, and Thomas Ferguson. And I also believe we can see strong influences on Pareto in the cliodynamic work of Peter Turchin. Now, one of the things that makes this so interesting is, while generally an advocate of classical liberalism, we can definitely see that his elite theory, just like with Robert Michel's, made him very copacetic to more conservative ends of the government because of his fear of workers. And while I said earlier he had maintained friendships with socialists in his early and middle ages, he becomes paranoid against them in his late life. Karl Popper has called Pareto the theoretician of totalitarianism, and many Marxists consider him, if not a fascist, a proto-fascist. I'm going to summarize the work of Mandelbrot, who summarized Pareto as follows. At the bottom of the wealth curve, he wrote, men and women starve and die young. In the broad middle of the curve, all turmoil and motion. People are rising and falling, climbing by talent or luck, or failing by alcoholism, tuberculosis, or other kinds of unfitness. You can hear a little bit of eugenics in there. At the very bottom of at the very top sit the elite of the elite, who control power and wealth, until they are unseated through revolution, are upheaval by a new aristocratic class. There is no such thing as progress in human history. Democracy is always a fraud. Human nature is primitive, emotional, and unyielding. The smarter, abler, stronger, and shrewder take the lion's share. The weak starve, lest society become degenerate. One can, Pareto wrote, compare the social body to the human body, which will promptly perish if prevented from eliminating toxins. Inflammatory stuff, and it's burned Pareto's reputation in general. See, Pareto actually thought the 80-20 rule was justified in action. There are people, though, who think that the assertion that Pareto would have been a fascist is just unfair. However, it seems pretty clear that Mussolini's move away from socialism to elitism and aristocratic control seems to have been influenced by Pareto. Now, in Pareto, we see a figure that, despite his relative devotion to classical liberalism, maintained that the progress seen in classical liberalism was a sham, and the social values were just a justification for one elite to replace another. This has a strong influence in both liberal and conservative notions of social hierarchy and class without traditional classes such as justification by separate estates or other forms of justification. Sometimes libertarians sound like Pareto. Yeah. Now, Pareto is a hard man to disentangle because he's important in many different fields. And his politics range from what we might call conservative liberalism to increasingly anti-democratic throughout his life. In short, he thought elites were inevitable. There was no way to get rid of elites. And the correct way to handle class divisions in society was to let the poor die, let the middle class generate new elites through thriving, and have the elites themselves be balanced in their competition with each other or be overthrown when they failed to do so. In his thinking, we can see a strange mixture of both the liberal Republican traditions such as Machiavelli and Adam Smith and David Hume, and even the conservative liberal Edmund Burke. But we can also see de Maistre and the idea that there was no pure way out of social conflict and there was no progress, just different elites replacing each other because of different weaknesses that they may have. It's a very grim view. It's going to come back up as we discuss social classes. But if this sounds like it's influential on many things, we must remember that elite sociology, while it is often tied to Italian fascism, is also tied to neoclassical economics, but it rejects many of the bourgeois virtues that one sees celebrated in people like Smith and his moral sentiments books or Hume as basically illusions. This will have a strong influence on the thinker of James Burnham, who devotes a lot of time to Pareto and his Machiavellians, now known as the modern Machiavellians. And in my next episode, I will talk about Werner Sombart, but then we will get to James Burnham and how this manifested in America and start talking about some of the early American theorists of social class before we get to C. Wright Mills. Now, I think there's some interesting things in here. Despite the anti-worker and elite tone and the assumption that only elites really drive society, this is an assumption that you're going to see in a lot of modern class theories. Michael Lind, for example, thinks that the working class and under is largely a stagnant class with professionals and petty bourgeois fighting and a real power elite or an overclass mediating between the two. And the high bourgeois being largely so removed from society that they barely have any political effect. And that is manifested in Lind's New Class War. Peter Turchin talks about generational cycles and elites in different fields and in government elites. He's not nearly as poetic as Pareto. and may even have some socialist sympathies. He doesn't seem to share Pareto's devotion to free markets or to the moral justification of stratas of societies and the elites being justified by their characteristics, which is something, again, you see in Pareto. But what you do see is a lot of things that you'll hear sometimes implicit in a lot of conservative thinkers. You have to decide whether these views are actually one of the natural inclinations of certain kinds of people in the establishment of political orders under liberal capitalist auspices. I'm not going to make that decision for you. But unlike Weber, who, while flirting with nationalism and even when he was in the SPD, was clearly a socialist, what we have with Pareto is someone who is vaguely on the right and only gets more right-wing over time, but is actually, in many ways, the children of people, even if they were nobles, who believed in the bourgeois 1848 revolutions. Deduce what you will from that. I will include a series of links and books that I consulted for this. Please like and subscribe, particularly if you like this, what we talk about when we talk about class series. It's going to be a very long series, I think, because there's so many theories to talk about before we get to contemporary theorists and sociologists. And that's just limiting ourselves from Marx and the major theorists of the late 19th century who kind of overlapped into the 20th through the 20th century. And I'm not going to cover everybody because there's far too many to cover. But there's a lot. I plan on covering Friedrich Pollock's administrative class, James Burnham's managerial revolution and managerial elites, C. Wright Mills's power elites, Lloyd Werner's theory of American social division, which was kind of the dominant view of social class in the United States for a long time. And we'll go from there until we get the contemporary theorists like Michael Lind, Barbara Ehrenreich, etc. All right. Well, I hope you've learned something. I know this one, the last two have been a little drier. And we'll talk again soon. See you when we talk about Werner Sombart.